We're on to chapter 2 of the ChessGoals Catalan course. In this chapter, we're going to look at the closed Catalan. So the moves start knight d4, knight f6, c4, e6, g3, d5, bishop g2, and bishop to e7. So most of your opponents will start out by playing bishop to e7, but sometimes they will insert bishop to b4 check, and then maybe drop the bishop back to e7. So we'll look at those lines in this chapter as well. You can see above my head, we have 10 lines total in this chapter. As we go through each line, I'll move that arrow so we can keep track of where we're at. So we're going to start with the main line and then work our way back up to less common variations. So after 4, bishop to e7, we recommend knight to f3. And after castle, castle, in chapter 1, we looked at the most common move, d takes c4. D takes c4 is something that players are going to play when they're a little bit more booked up. Black tries to open up the center, and that's the best move for black. In this chapter, we're going to look at the closed variations, and that can be a couple different move orders, either c6, knight b to d7, sometimes b6, combination of those move orders in any order. We're going to start with the main move order, pawn to c6, and then I'll talk you through some transpositions and other move orders that you have to think about. So c6, black is trying to make this sort of triangle formation, really solid center, solid d5 pawn. And after c6, we can play queen to c2. The queen is defending this pawn on c4, and we're preparing to play e4 in 2 moves. So that's what we want to do. When we see this closed structure, we want to play for e4. We want 3 pawns up on the 4th rank, and then give black that decision. Do they take on e4? Do they take on c4? Or do they just leave everything solid and let us play a move like e5? And then we can start a pretty big attack. So queen c2, that's the recommendation, knight b to d7. And now knight b to d2. So we're not putting the knight on c3 in this line. D takes c could happen. We safely put the knight on d2, defends the c4 pawn, and defends the e4 square, getting ready for our break. Now the strongest move for black is b6. And what you'll notice from the black side, they're trying to figure out how do we get that 4th minor piece developed. And the most natural way is to play b6 and bring the bishop out to b7. So b6, strongest move. And here we recommend pawn to e4. Going for that big center right away. We're perfectly fine with black capturing. Pawn takes or knight takes. We're good with that because we're going to build the big center afterwards. Black will not have a pawn on the 5th rank anymore. So first we will look at d takes e4. Most common move. Now knight takes e4. And if you look at the Stockfish eval here, Stockfish says we're already up 1 point. So material's equal. And being up 1 point according to Stockfish means that we have a lot of play in this position that goes above and beyond the material to equal a full point. And really that comes down to the space advantage that we have and the better placed minor pieces. So now let's look at bishop to b7. This is our main line. You'll see this about half the time, and the other half the time you pretty much will see knight takes e4. So you're going to see one of the two. Knight takes f6. And at this point, what black needs to play is pawn to c5. That's how they're going to neutralize the space advantage that we have with the pawns on c4 and d4. What we want to do in these positions is shut down that c5 break. If we don't allow black to play c5, it traps the bishop on b7. So always think of these Catalan positions in terms of imbalances. That imbalance of having the weak bishop on b7, that's what we're going to target. That's how we're going to play for our advantage. So now knight takes f6 for black, and here rook to d1. Look at this. We line the rook up with the black queen. So this c5 break is not possible because d takes c attacks the queen. Queen c7 for black. Now keep an eye on black's plan. They would like to play pawn to c5 again. So here we play bishop to f4 with a tempo on the queen. And we're okay with the dark squared bishop trade because we want to focus on the space long term and we want to focus on the light squared bishops. So dark square bishop trade, remember, that's okay with us. Bishop d6, main move. Here we're going to take, queen takes, and now pawn to c5. And here we still hold that 1 point Stockfish advantage, and that's thanks to our space and our superior bishop. So compare the g2 bishop that's attacking a pawn to the b7 bishop, which is trapped, and it's just defending a pawn. And our plan in this position, we're going to leave you with a plan in every one of these lines, is to play knight to e5. We want to bring this a rook to c1, and then go for queenside expansion with moves like a3 and b4. So that's line number 1. This is the main line with 1 trade. And next we're going to move to the main line with 2 trades. So going back to move 10, knight takes e4. In this position, we're going to look at knight takes e4 by black. So instead of retreating or moving their bishop out to b7, what happens if they take this knight right away? We still have a comfortable advantage in this line. So we're going to take with the queen, eyeing this pawn, bishop to b7. And now here we have a cool move, rook to e1. So black would like to play knight to f6, kicking our queen. And I really like this rook to e1 move because what we want to do is we want to put our a rook onto d1. It's much more common you'll see the f rook go to d1 right away. I'll show you why. This is going to be a nice move. Okay, so rook e1 for white, knight to f6, most natural move, attacking the queen right away. Queen back to e2. And at this point, if black wants to play c5, normally the rook on d1 would prevent that because d takes c and we're on the queen. But the rook on e1 also prevents that. And this is the key point. c5 can be met with d5. And that bishop on e7 is lined up with our queen and rook. So tactically, black cannot take on d5 with the pawn. So rook to c8 is going to be played most likely. And here we can play a quiet move, pawn to a3. We're not in a rush to do anything in the center right away. We're going to go for queenside expansion with an eventual plan to play c5, locking down that bishop once again on b7. So just keep that imbalance in mind. We want to keep that light square bishop of blacks trapped behind this pawn on c6. That's how we're going to grind out this long-term advantage and get this nice kind of Catalan pressure against black's queenside. Rook to e8 by black is most common. Now pawn to b4. And at this point, we're about to play c5. And if black anticipates this, which really they should, you'll find that your opponents tend to play c5 first, not letting you get that bind. So now we can play d takes c5. And we're going to have a long-term advantage here on the queen side. D takes c5, and here we can push past. So the first line we had a stockfish eval of +1. This line we have a stockfish eval of +2. And I think the reason for that is, again, the better placed pieces. But now we have this passed pawn, this potential passed pawn, I should say, on b5. The A and B pawns are going to push together, 2 versus 1. That's going to create a passer. And we also still have the nice light square bishop cutting across the board, and our dark square bishop is going to get on this long diagonal. So both bishops on long diagonals. This knight has the nice square knight e5. We still have a plan of playing rook a to d1. So bring both rooks to the center, both bishops on the long diagonals, knight on an active square, A and B pawns rushing up the board, and our plan is to expand on the queen side while keeping full control of the center. So that's line number 2. That's the main line with 2 trades by black. Now let's back up a little bit and look at what happens if black plays bishop to b7 on move 9. So this is back when we played pawn to e4. And we looked at d takes e4. So that was the 1 trade and the 2 trade variation. In this case, we're going to look at bishop to b7, the no trade variation. And this, I think, is actually really common at the club level. I've faced this many times and over the board. You'll see this in some of the annotated games included with this course. The computer likes this move a little bit better than d takes e4, but I think in practice, this is really difficult to play for black. So here we're recommending pawn to e5, kicking this knight off of f6. And what this is going to do is this is going to allow us to attack the king side. That f6 knight defends h7. And in these sort of structures, when you can wedge a pawn up on e5, kicking off that f6 knight, it gives great attacking potential against this h7 square. Knight to e8 by black. And here we play c takes d5. And the reason we do this is we want to force a fixed pawn structure in the center. And this is going to reduce black's counterplay while we attack kingside. So we attack kingside. They want to counter in the center or in the queen side. We're going to shut that down. Make the game all about the kingside play. C takes d5. Now we have this sneaky move, rook to e1. It's subtle. What we want to do is we want to move the the bishop to f1 and then bring him out to d3, pointing over at the h7 pawn. So we're just trying to use the f1 square to relocate our pieces. And sometimes even this knight could relocate to f1 in some variations. Rook to c8 by black, natural, kicking our queen. Queen to d1. Now here we have a little bit of maneuvering to do. So I just talked about this idea. Bishop to f1, bring it out to d3. Next we can play for h4 and knight to g5. And that's how we're going to form our kingside attack. It's kind of like the old fishing pole attack. We don't have the rook on h1 to help with that, but we want to just get that knight on g5, get that pawn up on h4, and if black takes on g5, we're completely fine with that. We're going to get an attack going one way or the other. And these black pieces are going to be disconnected from the king side. So that's the whole idea here. Black is cramped. It's not easy to shift all those pieces over to defend. Queen to c7 by black. Black wants to play for an endgame, so keep that in mind in these lines. Black wants to control the c-file, sink their rook into c2, get a lot of play that way, right? If the rook's on c2, then it's cutting across that second rank. So here I'm recommending a knight to b1. And this is a tricky move. If queen to c2 is played, you can take c2, and when the rook takes back, knight to c3. It actually traps the rook on c2, and then we can go scoop it up later. So queen c2 is a bad move by black. So let's look at pawn to b5. Here we can play a3. There's other good moves here as well. Bishop f1, pawn to h4. Even knight to c3 could be a good move. But a3 is a nice idea to shut down black's queenside play. So now black plays a5. And they want to get something going over here, right? Because if black can get a few trades going on the queen side, then the game becomes about the queen side action, and we don't get time to attack over on the king side. Here we can play bishop to f1 with the tempo on the pawn. And after bishop to a6, bishop to d2. So what we're doing here is we're pointing with both bishops over at the queen side. This is stalling black's queen side play. The advantage here is plus 1.5 according to Stockfish, and that's thanks to our king side attack. The plan is still to play bishop d3, pawn to h4, knight to g5. And pawn to b4 is actually a really good way to shut down the queen side play. So if you can get all of those moves in, all 4 of those moves, and start attacking king side, you're in great shape here. And Stockfish says plus 1.5. So we've looked at the 3 main lines so far. All of them have been a nice advantage for us. It's really good to see that. Now let's go back to move 6. And we're going to look at 6 b6 in this line. Actually, let's look at 6c5. This is kind of the Tarrasch system. We'll look at this first, and then we'll come back to b6. All right, so now we're going to play d takes c5. And what we're going to do is we're going to plan to allow this trade of all 4 central pawns. So we're fine with the trade of all of those pawns. And we want to have a lead in development once those trades happen and have the advantage with the minor pieces. So we keep talking about this Catalan bishop. That bishop cuts all the way across the board. That's going to be a superior bishop to either of black's bishops. So if we can kind of have these small imbalance advantages when the pawns trade off, we'll be in great shape. Bishop takes c5 by black. If d takes c4 was played, we can play queen to a4, regain the pawn that way. So just kind of show d takes c, queen to a4. So we're not doing the queen trade. We'll regain the pawn that way. After bishop takes c5, we have c takes d. And here you're going to see all 3 recaptures from black. E takes d, queen takes d, and knight takes d5. We're going to look at the most common, knight takes d5. But I think in the other cases, queen takes and pawn takes, we actually have an even larger advantage. So if you want to explore those on your own, you can. Knight takes d5 is the strongest. Queen c2. Hitting that bishop with a tempo. Putting our rook on d1. Lining it up with black's queen. So we each have 2 minor pieces out. But we have that really strong g2 bishop. And our queen's already developed more quickly than black's. And black has to figure out what to do with this attack on the bishop. After they retreat, rook to d1. And we're going to stop the line here. The eval is +1 according to Stockfish. And again, better placed pieces, and we have the potential for a kingside attack in this line. What we want to do is play pawn to e4, taking the knight. We can relocate our queen over to e2, so get her off open files. Get her off the C and D files. She just temporarily went to C2. And then we can play a knight to C3, bishop to F4. And you can see all of our pieces are very harmoniously developed. And once they're all developed, then we can start to poke at the black king side. We can play moves like knight to G5, poke at this H7 pawn. Get black to create some weaknesses in this position. You're a little head on space. You got the better placed pieces. You're going to have that pawn up on E4. It's very easy for black to make mistakes if you pressure them. So that's what to keep in mind. Always keep applying that pressure. Give some tough decisions to your opponent, and that's when they're going to make mistakes. So now going back to move 6, instead of the Tarrasch variation, we are now switching to early B6, I'm calling it. And when you see B6 played prior to C6, it sets up this really strange looking pawn structure, right? You have the bishop that's going to a fianchetto, bishop to B7, but it's running into this D5 pawn, and the C and D pawns are disconnected. So what we want to do in these types of structures is we want to try to make this pawn on C7 a weakness. We want to make it a backward pawn. So here we play C takes D, and look at this half open file pointing at the C pawn. That's kind of the idea here long term. E takes D5 for black. Now we play knight to C3. And here you can kind of notice like the structure looks weird, right? You're going to fianchetto this bishop and just use it to defend a weak pawn. Whereas our bishop is fianchettoed and attacking a weak pawn is definitely an advantage for us in terms of the bishops. So imbalance advantage white. Bishop B7. Here we go, bishop to F4. And look what we're doing. We're bringing some pressure on the C pawn. Black will do best here if they can get in their C5 break. So keep that in mind. That's the best plan for black. Knight B to D7. Rook to C1. Putting the rook on the half open file. Bringing a second attacker, eyeing that C7 pawn. And now that black has this knight out, helping defend, this is a good time for black to play C5. Here we're going to take. D takes C5. At this point, black has a choice. They can take with knight, or they can take with pawn. The eval here is around half a pawn for white, so we have a stockfish advantage. And the reason for that is, if you look at both options, if we break them down one at a time, taking with the knight gives black an IQP position. That means isolated queen pawn. And what we can do is we can blockade the queen's pawn, right? We can keep this knight an F3 guarding this square. We got the queen guarding this square. We could relocate the bishop to guard this square. So we have everything ready to blockade the dark square, and we have pieces attacking the pawn. So we control the pawn and the square the pawn wants to go to. That's the perfect setup against the IQP. And if black wants to play B takes C5, in that case, we get what's called hanging pawns. The pawn on C5 and D5 are hanging pawns. We can take advantage of this structure too. Something like knight H4 followed by knight to F5 is a great way to take advantage of those hanging pawns because this bishop doesn't guard the F5 square, right? If he were on this diagonal, he would guard F5. Knight coming to F5 is going to try to trade the knight for the dark square bishop, and we can get that bishop pair advantage as well as the hanging pawns to attack. So I like this position for white. It's actually one of the better lines for black that we've seen so far. But when you see this early B6, just keep that in mind. You want to take on D5 and try to make a weakness with that C7 pawn of black's. So now we're going to back up and look at a triangle defense from the black side. This is going to be C6 on move 4. After C6, this can transpose to bishop to E7 lines, so keep that in mind, but we're going to look at different variations where black plays bishop to D6. So our recommendation is still knight to F3. If an early C takes D is played, by the way, you can play knight to E5 as a way to regain the pawn. You'll have both knight and bishop attacking this pawn, so there's no B5 for black. Knight B to D7, castle, bishop to D6. So this is our triangle, bishop to D6. This is something that like a semi-Slav player might want to go for from the black side. And usually when you see this structure, black wants to play pawn to E5. So keep that in mind. Black really wants pawn to E5. So at this point, we're going to play knight to D2. Again, we see this knight come into D2 to safely guard the C4 pawn. and this e4 break. We always kind of want the e4 break once we're developed. Castle for black, rook e1. So again, we see this rook coming to e1. This is something where when I've played the Catalan in the past, I didn't appreciate rook e1 so much. I always wanted to use queen c2 to guard this e4 break. But rook e1 is actually a really strong way to play it because we don't always want the queen on c2. Sometimes we just want the rooks in the center, and we'll decide later where we want the queen. Maybe b3, maybe a4. So rook e1. Now black should play e5. If they don't play e5, we're getting e4 in really quick and threatening to play e5 ourselves even. So e5 by black. Now we can play c takes d. We're going to swap everything in the center and play against that isolated queen pawn again. C takes d, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes. So we're happy with all these trades. Bishop takes, knight f3, attacking the bishop and controlling the square in front of this isolated queen pawn sitting on d5. So again, we're controlling the square in front of the isolated pawn, and we're trying to attack the isolated pawn at the same time. One move too far. Bishop d6, bishop to e3. So look at this. All three pieces guard this d4 square. We have the bishop long term pointing at d5 and the queen pointing at d5 already. We want to bring a rook over to d1 soon. The eval here is plus 0.6 according to the engine. We have a nice advantage. And if we get a few moves in a row, here's our plan. Bishop d4, queen d3, bring this a rook either to c1 or d1. We go to c1, the other rook can come to d1, and then play pawn to e3. So we create this really solid setup, just completely blockading that d pawn. And when you get these Tarrasch structures where it switches to an isolated queen pawn for black, oftentimes the way black gets their counterplay for that isolated queen pawn is to create some sort of kingside attack. But the kingside attack is completely shut down. So we have this fianchetto structure, pawn on g3, it shuts down the play of this d6 bishop, right? So there's no compensation for the isolated queen pawn. So if you think of an isolated pawn as like maybe a half a point advantage, that's about what we're looking at here. Half a point because there's no comp for black. That's our triangle formation. Now let's look at d takes c4 here. We talked about this a little bit on the last move, that there was knight e5 in that position. In this position, since black already played their knight to d7, there's some other ways to defend this pawn on c4. For example, knight to b6. Here we're recommending pawn to a4. This prevents b5, and it also kind of gets ready for knight b6 because we can kick that knight. So now pawn to a5 by black. Black would still love to play b5 here if given the chance. So keep that in mind. Black wants to secure that pawn on c4. They want to hold that extra pawn. So let's go after it. Queen c2. We could take with the queen right away, but what we really want to do is take with this knight. This knight is going to route to a3, and then try to take on c4. Knight to b6, knight to a3. This pawn is falling. There's no way for black to defend this. And if we can get this pawn and play pawn to e4, we get the massive center with not much compensation for black. So that's what we're going for. Win that pawn and play e4. Black's best bet is to take the knight. What does this remind you of? This reminds you of chapter 1, the main line, where we play knight a3, we give up the pawn temporarily, and we get a ton of activity. That's what we're going for here. We have a lot of compensation for the pawn, more than enough. Castling by black, and at this point, we have a plus 1.3 stockfish advantage. That's due to space, first of all, bishop pair, second, and third, we have weak pawns in the black structure. c4, biggest weakness, b7, and a5 are also potential weaknesses. And what we want to do is put our rooks on b1 and d1, and then we can push e4 and go for this big center. This is one you can explore a little bit on your own, but I think because we looked at this so much in chapter 1, and we went really deep on a lot of those lines, I don't think we need to go as deep on this position in chapter 2, because you kind of already know the ideas. You know the way to apply pressure to black's position, and you know the mistakes that black tends to make in these positions. So these are the lines where black played the early c6 on move 4. The only thing we have left to look at is bishop to b4 check. And originally, this was a line where when I first started playing the Catalan, um, all the top grandmasters were doing this. They were throwing the check in first, making white block either bishop or knight, and then retreating their bishop right away and saying, hey, you put your bishop or knight on a bad square, d2, you actually wish it was back on its starting square. So it's a very subtle thing. It's gone down in popularity. Um, in the past, I've always played bishop to d2, and I think that's a perfectly fine choice. For this course, though, I'm going to recommend knight to d2. And the reason why is I think there's more chances for black to make a mistake. It's a less common move, but it scores really well at the club level. And the problem for black is if they trade bishop for knight, that gives us a very easy bishop pair advantage. That's what we want. We would love to have the two bishops, and black only has one, and that one bishop is a bad bishop for black. After knight to d2, black castles. Now we play knight to f3. And we're going to look at the three most common moves for black. D takes C, C5, and B6. And you can see those in the lines up above my head. So let's start with D takes C4. Black grabs this C pawn. They want to hold on to it. In this position, we can play queen to C2, immediately attacking the pawn. So I think the only critical line in this position is to look at pawn to B5. What if black really fights to hold it? Because if we win that pawn back, we just have a very easy Catalan advantage. A4, trying to undermine this pawn, and look at our bishop, cutting across that long diagonal. Pawn to C6 by black, A takes B5. So what we're doing here is we're opening up this diagonal, and we're going to have more than enough compensation for this extra pawn, and we have some combinations coming up. C takes D. Look at this diagonal. Now we can play knight to G5. How does black stop? Bishop takes A8. Usually black would play knight to D5. That's their typical way in these Catalan structures to stop that bishop attacking the rook. Queen takes H7, checkmate though. Keep that tactic in mind. So black should play a move like H6. But now, pawn to H4. This is the fishing pole tactic. Black cannot safely take because pawn takes back, attacking the knight. And we have both queen and rook eyeing the checkmate square with queen to H7 threatened. So let's say black gets greedy. Queen takes D4. They know they're going to lose the rook, so they should try to gain some material back in the meantime. Maybe get, the exchange in two pawns for the rook. Queen takes D4 makes sense. Bishop takes A8. And this is a perfect time to recapture. Black either could play knight to C6, just giving the knight back. But rook to D8 is what we're going to look at here. And the idea with rook to D8 is this knight is still attacked. And maybe black could sneak in knight to D5 because the king can run now. But at this point, we can just simply play knight to F3, kicking the queen. We're up 3 points in material. So a huge material advantage. Our king is relatively safe. Like even though he's on E1 right now, still needs to get castled. This is a +3 or +4 stockfish advantage. And that's thanks to the 3 points of material. And essentially it's an equal position in terms of the dynamics, right? So there are some imbalances favoring black here, like active rook, active queen and bishop, 2 extra queen side pawns, but there's also imbalances favoring us. So pretty much equal on the imbalances. Our plan here can be king to F1, followed by coming up to G2, bringing a rook to D1, playing a move like knight to E4, offering some trades, bishop out to F4. Once we get all those moves in, you're going to see that +3 or +4 go up into the completely winning territory. So unless black can really do something quick, this is going to go downhill. I mean, 3 points of material advantage, that's huge. So now let's move to bishop to B4, check with C5 next. So C5 just played, and here we can play pawn to A3. So what we're doing is we're kicking this bishop on B4 and making it decide. Does that bishop want to take on d2, giving us the easy bishop pair, or retreat to a5, where it leaves the defense of the c pawn? Leaving the defense of the c pawn is a bad decision. It's not easy for black to win that pawn back if we simply take, because we have b4 coming next. So black needs to give us the bishop pair. When you see c5, kick that bishop, make black give you the bishop pair. Queen takes d2. Queen takes d2 always looks a little bit strange at first, but you're going to get used to it in this Catalan course. The idea is, even though we're blocking in the c1 bishop, it's a quick way to connect our rooks. So we don't necessarily want our dark square bishop on d2. A lot of times he'll go out to b2, but having the queen here makes sense because the rooks are connected one move faster. It's just a Catalan little subtlety here. And we'd like to play d takes c5 next if it were our move in this position. So c takes d4, removing that idea for us. C takes d5. And notice how both the knight and queen are ready to capture on d4. Queen takes d5, queen takes d4. So had the bishop been on d2 with the queen on d1, we wouldn't have the quick queen takes d4. That's another nice way to remember that move. And as we've said in other ChessGoals courses, we only recommend the queen trades when we feel that there's enough winning chances for our side. So here we're allowing the queen trade, but I think we have enough winning chances thanks to this long-term advantage with the bishop sitting on g2. Knight c6, and here we can take. If you don't want the queen trade here, queen to h4 is a perfectly good move to avoid it. Knight takes d5, we castle, b6, black's trying to get their last minor piece out. Here we can play rook to d1. The eval here is about 0.4, so close to half a pawn advantage for white, and that's thanks to our bishop pair. What we'd like to do is play pawn to e4, knight to d4, bishop to e3. And we're going to play for tactics in a wide open position using our bishop pair. This should be a fun one. Nice half point advantage. So then moving on to our last line, b6. At this point, we could play c takes d immediately, but it's a little bit different than the other line with the bishop on b4 because our knight's stuck on d2, right? So we don't get that quick pressure. That's how you can remember this. Don't play c takes d right away. Here we're going to castle. Remove that pin of the bishop. A3 is also a good move here. But either way, the idea is we want to make that bishop on b4 feel like he's a misplaced piece. So now bishop to b7. Here I'm recommending pawn to b3. And what we're doing here is we're keeping firm control of this square on e5, bishop to b2. So we're going to have bishop pointing at it, pawn attacking it, knight attacking it. All of these pieces helping control that e5 square. Knight d7, bishop to b2. And here you can kind of see our plan coming into place. We want rook to c1, we want knight to e5, pawn to a3, make black move that bishop again, and just keep expanding. And we have a cool idea coming up, by the way, with this knight. We're going to reroute it. Rook to e8, rook to c1. At this point, we could play c takes d again, but I kind of like keeping this tension. If you saw Smithy Q's video on our YouTube channel, sometimes keeping the tension can really favor the side that has the advantage, and that's the case here. Black still has this c7 weakness to think about. We're going to just keep the tension here and let black figure out what to do. We have better placed pieces. Pawn to a5. This is a common idea when white plays b3, black plays a5, a4. And now here's our cool move. Knight to b1. What we want to do is play pawn to c5, pawn to a3, trapping that bishop. What a cool maneuver. So the eval here is only plus 0.2. I say only because black has done well. They've played moves that are rated highly by Stockfish. But I think with this plan of trying to trap the bishop, we have pretty good advantage here. There's good practical chances. We could also go for knight e5 and bring that knight back to d3 as a way to attack the bishop as well. So that's another idea to keep in mind. Or capturing on d5 and kind of going for that plan of playing down the c file. That's another idea. So small advantage here, but still an advantage nonetheless. So that wraps up chapter 2, the closed Catalan chapter. We will see you guys in chapter 3.